Della Coyne folded her mother's quilt into a square the morning after they buried her father. She did not cry. She carried it out of the main house, past the room that had been hers, and set it on the bunkhouse cot, because her brother Emmett had already moved his wife into her mother's bed, and a folded quilt takes up less room than a grudge. At the wake, before 11 neighbors and the preacher, Emmett dragged their father's chair to the head of the table, sat himself down in it, and said, "A working ranch is no place for a spinster's bookkeeping." Vinia laughed. So the next morning I saddled the roan and rode the 9 miles to Fort Haskell, to the one drawer in that whole territory with my name written on what was inside it. If you've ever been treated as invisible by your own family, this story is for you. Before I go on, do me one small kindness. Tap that subscribe button, and in the comments tell me the town you're watching from. I want to see how far Della's ride carries. Go on. I'll wait right here. All right. Let me tell it slow, the way it happened. I am 41 years old, and I am telling you this from a porch that catches the morning sun. I am at peace now. I want you to hold on to that, because the middle of it is hard, and I don't want you worrying over me while I get there. I came out the far side. But I have to walk you back to the beginning, to a low log house on a rise of Wyoming grass, to understand how a woman with nothing anybody wanted ended up holding everything. My name is Della Coyne. My father was Amos Coyne, and he built the lazy sea with his own 2 hands and a borrowed bull, out where the Cordell Road forks toward the Powder. Nobody handed him that ground. He proved it in blood and bad winters, and I grew up watching him do it. I was the daughter who stayed. That's the whole shape of my life, if you want it plain. My brother Emmett was 3 years older and gone by the time he was 20. He rode off to the cattle towns, Ogallala, Dodge, the loud places where a young man can lose himself and call it living. My mother passed while he was down there somewhere, and he did not come home for it. I stayed. I learned the outfit the way you learn a person's face. Every draw, every seep, every stretch of fence that sagged in a thaw. And I kept the books. I want you to understand what that meant, because most folks then didn't. And it's the whole hinge of this story. Somebody has to know the numbers. Somebody has to know how many head went to the high pasture and how many came back, what the freighter charged, what the store took, what was owed and what was owing. My father had a gift for grass and cattle. He had no patience at all for a column of figures. So the year I turned 32, he set the ledger in front of me and said, "You've got the head for it, Della. It's yours now." I kept those books for 9 years. 9 years, through the drought that cracked the creek bottoms to gray tile, when we hauled water in barrels and prayed. Through the bad winter, the one the old-timers still measure other winters against, when the snow came in October and did not leave, and we lost a third of the herd standing up, frozen where they drifted against the fences. 400 head, gone by spring thaw. I counted the carcasses myself so the number would be true, and I wrote it in the ledger in a steady hand while my father sat by the stove and could not look at the page. We came back from that. It took us 3 years, but we came back. And we came back because the books held. Because when the bank in Cordell wanted to know if the lazy sea could carry its paper, I could show them, to the dollar, that it could. And there was one line in those books that mattered more than all the cattle we owned. The Army beef contract. Fort Haskell sat 9 miles off, a scatter of adobe and timber holding the road, and the Army there had to be fed. Soldiers eat beef. A quartermaster with 200 men and a payroll needs a rancher who will deliver good stock, on time, at a fixed price, and not cheat him on the weight. My father won that contract the honest way, years back, and it renewed every spring. I was the one who rode out for it. I learned Captain Mercer's forms the way I learned the fence lines. Mercer was the quartermaster, a spare, careful man with ink on his cuffs and no give in him at all. He ran his office like a man who has been burned by a loose account once and swore never again. Everything by the form. Everything signed, dated, and filed in its drawer. Some men found him cold. I found him restful. There is a kind of honesty in a man who will not bend a rule even when bending it would be kind, and I trusted it. Every spring I rode the 9 miles and sat across from Mercer, and we went through it line by line, head per month, price per hundredweight, delivery days, and when it was right, I signed it. I want to stop here because this is the thing everybody in my family sailed right past, and it's the thing you should hold. Let me tell you about the tin box. My father kept a Bible on the shelf by his bed, a heavy black book with his own father's name in the front. It didn't get read much. But hollowed into the space behind it, tucked flat against the wall, was a small tin box, the kind that once held tea. And in that box lived the papers that ran the season, deeds, the banknote when there was one, and every spring, the renewed Army contract folded in thirds. I signed that contract because I was the one who rode out. That was the whole reason. My father couldn't be bothered to make the ride, and Emmett was off in the cattle towns, and it was easier for everyone if the name on the paper matched the hand that carried it. Nobody thought a signature was worth arguing over. It was a chore, like filling the wood box. You don't fight over who fills the wood box. Remember, the tin box. That's all I ask. Now, Emmett, he came home the spring before all this, and he came home changed. He'd been gone the better part of 20 years, and he came back with a wife and a wardrobe and a way of standing in a room like he was measuring it for himself. Vinya was her name. His wife. A Cordell-minded woman who looked at our low-log house the way you'd look at a coat you meant to replace. Emmett had Cattletown money in his talk and Cattletown debts under it, though I didn't know the size of those debts yet. He came home with certainty. That's the word I keep landing on. Emmett came home certain that the ranch was his by rights of being the son, certain that whatever had happened in the 20 years he was gone was just the place keeping itself warm for him. He was not unkind to Papa, I'll give him that. He sat with the old man in those last months and let him talk about grass, and Papa, well, a father wants his son home. Papa softened toward him the way you soften toward a thing you've grieved and gotten back. But Papa never handed him the books. I noticed that. At the time, I thought it was nothing. Later, I understood it was everything. Papa died in April. Quiet. In the bed my mother had died in. We put him in the ground on a Tuesday, under a sky the color of a rifle barrel, and half the county came. Because half the county owed Amos Coyne a good turn, and knew it. And the morning after we buried him, before the coffee was cold, Emmett took the house. He did it gentle, which was almost worse. He came into the kitchen, where I was standing at my father's stove, and he said, "Della, Vinya and I'll take the main room. It's only sensible, man and wife. You'll be more comfortable out in the bunk quarters anyhow, you being on your own. More comfortable." I had slept in that main house every night of my 41 years. My things were in it. My mother's things were in it. But I looked at my brother's face, and it was already decided behind his eyes, the way a thing is decided in a man who has been telling himself a story on a long ride home. And I thought, he's grieving too. I thought, it's the first morning. I thought, blood is blood, and a house is only boards, and I will not be the one who fights over boards the day after we buried Papa. That was my mistake. I'm going to name it for you plainly, because it cost me, and if you're the kind of person this story is for, it might be your mistake too. I believed that fairness would protect me. I believed that if I was good and quiet and let the small things go, then the people who shared my blood would see it and be fair back. I let him take the visible things without a fight, and I told myself that made me the bigger soul. It didn't. It just made me easy to take from. So I gathered my things. And the last thing I carried out was my mother's quilt, the double wedding ring, pieced by her own hands the winter before I was born, the one thing in that house that was hers, and then mine, and nobody else's. I found it already folded on the bed, set aside, because Vinya had her own quilts from town and did not want an old woman's needlework on her new bed. I didn't cry. I want you to know that. I picked it up, and I folded it into a clean square, corner to corner, the way my mother taught me, and I carried it out to the bunk room and laid it on the cot. And I smoothed it flat with both hands. That's a small thing. A quilt. You might think it's a small thing. But I have learned that the small takings are how they teach you what you're worth to them. He didn't take the quilt out of need. He took it because it was easy, and because taking it told me where I stood, and telling me where I stood was, I think, the whole point. That was the first one. The second came inside a week, and this one had a witness, a boy named Silas Boone. Silas was 19 then, a ranch hand my father had taken on 2 winters back, an orphan-ish kind of boy, with more loyalty in him than sense, though his sense grew fast that year. Silas had loved my father, loved him the way a boy loves the first man who ever treated him like he'd amount to something. And Silas, without anybody telling him to, had appointed himself to watch out for me. I didn't ask it. He just did it. Silas was there in the office room, really just a corner of the barn with a plank desk, the morning Emmett took down the brand book. Every outfit keeps a brand book. It's the record of the iron. The lazy C, a C laid on its back, and beside every entry, the tally, and in the front, in my father's hand, and then in mine, the names of who ran it, Coyne, Amos, and, after the year he gave me the books, Della, my name was in the brand book of the ranch I'd kept alive through drought and killing winter. Emmett took a penknife to it. He scratched my name out. I wasn't in the room, Silas told me after, and his voice shook telling it, this 19-year-old boy trying to be steady. Emmett scratched Della Coyne out of the brand book and out of the tally ledger, drew a line through it clean, and wrote his own name in over the erasure. And when Silas, bless him, said, "Mr. Coyne, that's Miss Della's book. She keeps that," Emmett didn't even look up. He said, "The lazy C answers to one coin now, son. You'd do well to learn which one." One coin now. When Silas told me, I felt something cold move through me, and I did not let it reach my face. I told the boy it didn't matter. I told him a name in a book doesn't move a single head of cattle, and the work was the work no matter whose name was over it. I believed some of that. And I want to be honest with you, I kept the books that week anyway. I kept them because they needed keeping. Because a note was coming due I'll tell you about, and because the numbers don't care who's been thanked. But I kept them out of the office corner now. I kept them in the bunk room, on my knee, by lamplight, like a thing I was ashamed of. That's how they had me thinking by then. Ashamed of the one thing that would save me. The third one was public, and it was meant to be. There's a supper the Cordell cattlemen hold in the spring, before the drives, in the long room over the mercantile. The ranchers come, and the buyers come up from the railhead, and it's half business and half bragging, and everybody's account with everybody else gets settled in the open, by who's seen to be doing well and who isn't. It matters. A man standing at that supper is a man's credit for the year. Emmett went as the master of the lazy sea. He wore a new coat. Vinya went on his arm in Cordell silk. I went because I always went. I'd gone 9 years running to talk numbers with the buyers, because I was the one who knew the numbers. I sat down the table where I always sat, and partway through the meal, when the room was warm and full and the buyers were listening, Emmett stood up. He talked about the lazy sea. He talked about 1,140 head running his grass, and he said his, clear as a bell, 1,140 head, and every one of them mine. He talked about the season coming, the drives, the army beef going to Fort Haskell. He presented himself before the whole assembled county and the men who'd be writing the checks. as the sole owner of the outfit my father built and I had kept. And then, because a man like that can't help but drive the nail all the way, he found me down the table with his eyes, and he smiled, and he said, "My sisters helped keep some of the household accounts, and I'm grateful. But a working ranch runs on grass and beef, gentlemen, not on a woman's bookkeeping. We'll manage the real business at this end." The laughter that ran the table wasn't cruel. Exactly. That's what I've never forgotten. It was easy. It was the laughter of a room agreeing that of course, the woman keeps the household accounts and the men run the ranch, and isn't it good of her brother to be grateful? Vinya laughed loudest and turned her Cordell face to the buyer beside her. I counted the men in that room. I don't know why I did it. Some part of me was already keeping the ledger of it. 9 ranchers. 4 buyers. Old Pardee from the bank. The 2 mercantile men. I counted the witnesses to my erasing, and I filed the number away, without knowing yet what account it would one day close. I said nothing. I finished my supper. I passed the bread when it came to me. And I have thought since that this was the moment Emmett felt tallest, standing in that warm room, sole lord of 1,140 head, his sister silent and shrunk down the table where the ledgers are kept. He never once asked, in all of it, who the army actually paid. The 4th came fast on the heels of the 3rd, and it was the one that told me he was in trouble, though I don't think he knew he was telling me. He sold my roan. That mare was mine. Bought with my own money, off my own line of the books, broke by my own hands. She was the horse I rode to Fort Haskell every spring. And Emmett sold her, to a man in Cordell, without a word to me, and pocketed the money, and rode into the county seat to record the Lazy C into his own name at the courthouse, clean and legal, so there'd be no question in the record of who owned it. And while he was in Cordell recording himself as sole owner, he stopped at the stockman's bank and signed a note. I found out the size of it from the papers. Because, and here is the thing my brother never grasped, the note came home to the tin box. It had to. That's where the ranch's paper lived, and habit runs deeper than spite. Even taking everything from me, Emmett didn't think to move the papers, because moving the papers would have meant understanding the papers, and understanding the papers was beneath him. So, Josiah Pardee's note, signed in Emmett's own hand, ended up folded in my father's Bible box with everything else, and one night by lamplight I read it. $6,800. Due in 90 days. Against the ranch, the land, the whole outfit as security. I sat on the bunk with that note in my hand, and I understood my brother all the way down. He'd come home with Cattletown debts. He'd needed money, to cut a figure, to pay off whatever he'd left owing in Ogallala, to be the baron in a new coat. So he'd mortgaged the ranch the day he made it legally his, $6,800 against the grass and the herd, 90 days to pay. And how did a man like Emmett plan to pay $6,800 in 90 days? The beef money. Of course the beef money. The Army beef contract was the one sure river of cash the Lazy C had. 45 head a month to Fort Haskell, paid steady, the closest thing to certain money a ranch ever sees. Emmett had heard about the contract his whole life. He knew the Army bought our beef. In his mind, it was just another thing that came with the ranch, the grass, the cattle, the brand, and the Army paying for beef. He'd signed a 90-day note dead certain that the season's Army money would cover it, and then some. He never once checked whose name was on the contract. He owned the grass now. He owned the cattle. He'd carved his name into the brand book and the courthouse record, and he had built his whole reckoning, his debt, his standing, his gamble, on a river of money he assumed ran to him, and had never bothered to read the paper that said where it ran. I want to tell you what happened in me over those next days, because it's the true turn of the whole thing, and it didn't look like anything from the outside. The pain went to resolve. There's a stretch in a story like this where you'd expect the wronged woman to weep, or rage, or pack a bag and leave for a sister in Kansas. I didn't do any of that. I got very quiet and very still, and something in me that had been bending for weeks stopped bending and sat, like a fence post tamped down hard. I kept the books. That's the plain fact of what I did. Nobody thanked me for it anymore. My name was scratched out of them, remember? But the note was ticking, and the season's numbers had to be kept true, and I was the only soul on that place who could keep them. So every night I sat in the bunk room and did the work I was no longer allowed to be seen doing. And every night the tin box sat there on the shelf. And I knew what was in it, and I understood slowly, the way you understand a thing you've known all your life but never had reason to say out loud. I understood exactly what my brother was standing on, and exactly what he'd never looked down to check. There came an evening, Silas found me in the bunk room with the lamp low, the contract unfolded on my knee beside the note. He'd brought me a plate from the cookhouse. The boy was always feeding me those weeks, like he could keep me whole with beans and biscuit. He set it down, and he looked at the papers, and he looked at me. And he said, "Quiet. Miss Della, what are you going to do?" I didn't answer him for a while. And then I told him the truth, calm as still water, because I'd finally seen it whole, and it had stopped hurting, and started being simple. I said, "Silas, he took the grass, he took the cattle, he scratched Papa's name and my name out of the book and put his own in. He's told the whole county he's the only Coyne that matters." I folded the contract back into its thirds while I said it. "But the army never bought grass. Silas, the army never bought one blade of it. It buys my signature." I set the folded paper flat on my knee under my hand, and in all his taking, my brother never once asked whose name was on the thing the money runs through. Silas looked at me for a long moment. He was 19, and I watched him understand it. I watched the whole architecture of it land in that boy's face. The grass and the cattle worth nothing. Worth less than nothing. Worth a $6,800 debt if the money that fed them ran to somebody else. He didn't whoop. He was too good a boy for that, and he'd loved my father too much to make a game of it. He just said, very low, "The old man never moved that contract off your name. All these years." "No," I said. "He never did." I didn't understand yet why. I thought it was habit, same as I've told you, that nobody thought a signature was worth arguing over. It was only later, when I found what else was in that tin box, that I understood my father had known exactly what he was doing, and had done it on purpose, and had done it years before he had any reason to think he'd need to. But that's further on. I won't get ahead of it. That's a part of the story that tempers everything, and it deserves its own quiet moment, and this isn't it. This is the moment I made up my mind. I didn't sleep much that night, and in the gray before dawn, while the main house was dark and Emmett and Vinya slept in my mother's bed, I got up and I dressed in the cold. I couldn't take the roan. He'd sold her out from under me, so I took the old bay gelding out of the corral, the plain one nobody wanted, and I saddled him by feel in the dark, and I slid the tin box out from behind my father's Bible and put the folded contract inside my coat against my heart. And I rode the 9 miles to Fort Haskell. It was a fine cold morning, the kind the high plains give you in spring, the grass silvered with frost and the light coming up pink over the powder country. I rode it slow. I wasn't running from anything, and I wasn't running to anything I couldn't do calm. I had done that ride 100 times with the contract in my coat, and it had always been a chore. This time it was the most important 9 miles of my life, and it felt exactly the same, and I think that's why I could do it, because my hands knew the way even when everything else in the world had turned over. Fort Haskell woke up around me as I rode in, the bugle, the smoke from the cook fires, the flag going up the pole. I put the bay up at the rail outside the quartermaster's office, and I brushed the dust off my coat, and I went in. Captain Mercer was at his desk, as he was every morning with his ledgers squared and his pen already wet. He looked up. He knew me, 9 springs of me across that desk. He said, Miss Coyne. Not Della. Mercer never used a Christian name in that office in his life. You're early on the season. I said, Captain, I've come to sign the renewal. And here is where I want you to watch my brother's whole world quietly turn over, though he was 9 miles off in a warm bed and didn't feel the ground move. Because I sat down across from Captain Harlan Mercer, and I took the folded contract out of my coat, and I laid it on the desk between us and smoothed it flat with both hands, the same way I'd smoothed my mother's quilt on the bunkroom cot, corner to corner, calm. Mercer took it up and read it through, top to bottom, the way that man read everything, missing nothing. 45 head a month. Price per hundredweight. Delivery days, and down at the bottom, on the line for the holder of record, 1 name in 9 years of ink. It's all in order, Mercer said. Same terms. You'll sign as before? And I want you to know I did not tell that honest man 1 word about my family. Not one. I didn't tell him my father was dead. I didn't tell him my brother had taken the house and the herd and my name out of the book. It was none of the Army's business, and Mercer would not have cared if it were. He ran his office by the form, and the form did not have a line on it for grief or spite or who felt they ought to own what. The form had a line for the holder of record, and it asked 1 question, and 1 question only. Whose name is on it? I picked up his pen. I dipped it, and I signed the season's renewal in my name alone, Della Coyne, in the same steady hand I'd counted 400 frozen carcasses in, the same hand that had held the Lazy Seas books through drought and killing winter, and 9 years of nobody thinking a signature was worth arguing over. And then I did the 1 thing more that made it iron. I asked Captain Mercer to note me, formal and filed, as the sole holder of record for the season, that the Army's payment for Lazy Sea beef, 45 head a month, near $9,400 across the year, would be paid to Della Coyne, and to no other soul on this earth. Mercer didn't blink. Why would he? It was the same name as every year. He drew the line, and he entered it in his own ledger, and he blotted it, and he slid the paper into the drawer, the 1 drawer in that whole territory, with my name written on what was inside it, and he pushed the drawer shut. It made a small sound. A wooden, ordinary sound. A drawer closing. I have heard cannons since, at Fort Haskell, on the 4th. None of it was ever as loud to me as that drawer. Because in that moment, 9 miles from home, without a raised voice, without a threat, without telling a single living person outside that office what I had done, I held the whole thing. My brother owned the grass and the cattle and the brand and a $6,800 debt due in 90 days. And I held the paper the only money ran through, and the money would come to my hand and no other, and there was not 1 legal thing on the green earth he could do about it. I thanked Captain Mercer. I always thanked him. He said, "Good day, Miss Coyne," and he was already back in his ledger before I reached the door. I rode the 9 miles home slow, in the full risen sun now, with the empty tin box light in my coat and the whole weight of the thing settled easy on my shoulders, and I want to tell you I felt triumphant. I didn't. Not yet. What I felt was quiet. Because I knew what I was riding back into. I was riding back into a house where I would have to go on keeping the books nobody thanked me for, and pass the bread at supper, and answer yes and no to a brother who thought he'd erased me, and say not 1 word of what sat filed in a drawer at Fort Haskell, for weeks, until the day the wagon rolled to the fort and the whole county was watching. I would have to act as if nothing at all had changed. And the hardest silence I would ever keep was just beginning. Because that same evening, as I was putting up the bay, Emmett came out of the main house with a paper in his hand and Pardee's Bank on his mind, and he called across the yard to me, "Easy. Careless. The Lord to the help. Della, those fort papers all in order for the season?" And I looked at my brother standing in my father's doorway, certain as sunrise, 90 days on a note he couldn't cover, and I opened my mouth to answer him. I said, signed and filed. Emmett. All in order for the season. Every word of it true. Not one of them the truth. He nodded like a man who'd expected nothing less, and he tucked Pardee's paper back in his coat, and he went in to his supper. The screen door clapped behind him. I stood in the yard a moment longer with my hand on the bay's warm neck, and I let my heart come back down to a walk. That was the first time I lied to my brother without lying. It would not be the last. Now I have to tell you about the weeks that followed, because they were the hardest work I ever did, and none of it showed. There was no cattle in it, no branding iron, no ledger even. The work was holding my face still. The work was going on being the woman they thought they'd buried alongside our father. I got up before light. I made the coffee in the bunk room on the little stove Silas rigged for me, and I carried the pot across the cold yard to the main house because Vinya liked her coffee brought. She'd sit at my mother's table in my mother's chair, and she'd say, "Set it there," and point. And I set it there. I passed the bread. I answered yes and no. I kept the books I was no longer thanked for keeping, because somebody had to know how many head we had and what the feed cost, and Emmett surely didn't. And the whole time, filed 9 miles east in a drawer at Fort Haskell, my name sat on the only money that ranch would ever see. I'll be honest with you, there were nights it nearly broke loose out of me. Vinya had a way of talking about the paperwork like it was a chore she'd graciously left to the help. She said once, at the table, spooning up my mother's good preserves, "Emmett handles the ranch. Della handles the little things. It suits everyone." And I looked at my plate, and I said nothing. And I thought, you have no idea what the little things are worth. But I didn't say it. Saying it would have cost me everything. Silence was the only thing I owned outright, and I meant to keep it whole until the day it was worth spending. Silas knew. Silas was 19 years old, and he'd watched Emmett scratch my name out of the brand book with his own 2 eyes, and he'd said nothing then, and he said nothing now. But he'd come find me at the corral of an evening, and he'd fuss with a latch that didn't need fussing, and he'd say low, "You all right, Miss Della?" And I'd say I was. And once he said, "Whatever it is you're waiting on, I hope it's a big one." I told him it was. I didn't tell him what. Then the near thing happened. It was maybe 2 weeks on. Emmett came into the barn while I was at the tally ledger, and he stood over my shoulder, close, and I felt every hair on my neck go up. He was looking at the numbers. He said, 45 head to the fort this month. Same as always?" "Same as always," I said. "And they pay on delivery." "They pay on delivery," I said. I kept my pencil moving. I did not stop. That was the whole trick of it. You keep your hands doing an ordinary thing, and the fear doesn't reach your voice. He stood there, a breath too long. I thought, this is it. He's going to ask the one question. He's going to ask whose name is on it. And if he asks it plain, I will not lie plain. I decided that much. I'd tell him the truth to his face before I'd forge a word. But he didn't ask it. Why would he? He'd never once thought to ask it in his life. To Emmett, the money came out of cattle the way water comes out of a spring. The cattle were his, so the water was his. And that was the beginning and the end of his arithmetic. He clapped me on the shoulder like I was a good dog, and he said, "Keep it tidy," and he walked out into the sun. I sat there and I shook for a minute. Then I went back to my numbers. Relief is a strange thing. It doesn't feel like joy. It feels like the ground being still under you after you'd braced for it to drop. The debt clock was ticking the whole while, and Emmett could hear it, and it didn't worry him a lick. That's the part still amazes me. Word came out from Cordell. Pardee's man rode all the way to the gate to bring it, that the $6,800 note fell due in 11 days. 11 days. I watched Emmett read that paper on the porch, and I watched him smile. He smiled because he'd done his sums, the only sums he knew. 45 head a month to the fort. Near $9,400 across the year. The note was $6,800. The beef would cover it and leave money over, and he'd stand in Pardee's Bank a baron with his debt paid and his empire clear. He said to Vinya, right out on the porch, loud enough I heard it at the woodpile, "Told you the fort would carry us. Della'll have the papers, I'll have the beef, Pardee gets his money, and this whole place is ours free and standing." And Vinya said something I didn't catch, and they both laughed, easy as anything, and I split another round of stovewood, and I said not one word. He ordered the gather. 45 head, the monthly drive to Fort Haskell, and he said he'd write it in himself this time. His own name on the delivery, he said. Time the army learned who ran the lazy sea. Silas caught my eye across the yard when Emmett said it, and I gave the smallest shake of my head, and Silas looked back at the cattle like he'd heard nothing at all. The morning the wagon rolled for the fort, I saddled the bay and I rode out ahead of them, alone, the way I'd ridden that road 100 times over 9 years. Nobody thought a thing of it. The bookkeeper going to see to her papers. Let them think it. I rode the 9 miles with my heart going steady now, not scared anymore, because the waiting was near done, and I got to Fort Haskell before the dust of Emmett's drive showed on the road behind me. I want you to see the parade ground the way I saw it that day. Hard-packed dirt swept clean, the flag up on its pole in a dry wind. 2 ranks of soldiers turned out, because delivery day was a formal thing at Fort Haskell. Captain Mercer ran it by the book, and the book said the beef was received in good order and paid for in the open. There were the 2 buyers down from Cordell to watch the count. There were teamsters and a sutler and men along the rail. And there was Emmett, riding in at the head of his drive, sitting his horse tall, 45 head of good lazy sea beef bawling and shouldering into the receiving pens, and his crew behind him, and his face, I'll never forget his face, the face of a man arriving at the exact center of the world he'd built. He didn't even see me at first. I stood back by the office wall, plain as a fence post. Captain Mercer came out with his ledger and his clerk, and the count was made, head by head, the way it's always made, and it came to 45, and it was good beef, and Mercer noted it down. Then Mercer opened the contract. The folded contract. My contract. And he read from it the way he read from everything. Flat, careful, every word given its full weight. Because to Harlan Mercer, a form was a form, and a name was a name, and there was no power under heaven would make him read it different than it was written. He said, "Delivery received, 45 head, in good order." He turned a page. He said, "Payment to be rendered to the holder of record." Emmett swung down off his horse and came forward with his hand half out already. Easy. Expecting. And Captain Mercer read the name. He said it plain, to the whole assembled ground, holder of record, Della Coyne. I have played that moment over 10,000 times. The dry wind. The flag popping. The cattle bawling in the pens behind my brother. And that name, my father's daughter's name, the name Emmett, had scratched out of a brand book with the back of a knife, read out loud by an officer of the United States Army in front of neighbors and buyers and 2 ranks of men. Emmett stopped with his hand still out. He said, No, I'm Emmett Coyne. I own the lazy sea. That's my beef in your pens." "I don't doubt it, sir," Mercer said. He wasn't unkind. He was just immovable. "The beef is received, and the beef is yours to deliver. But the contract names the payee, and the Army pays the holder of record, and no other. Those are my orders, and I don't have the latitude to bend them." He turned to me. He said, "Miss Coyne." And I stepped out from the wall. I walked across that swept dirt in front of every one of them, and I stood before the little table, and Captain Mercer counted the money into my open hand. Cash, coin and paper both. 45 heads worth, and he counted it slow and aloud the way the form required, and every number fell into that quiet, like a stone into a well. Emmett didn't move. His crew didn't move. The buyers from Cordell stood with their mouths a little open, because they'd sat at that cattleman's supper and heard Emmett call me a spinster with a bookkeeper's habits, and now they were watching the whole season's money cross the air into the spinster's hand. I closed my fingers on it. I said, "Thank you, Captain." I always thanked him. He said, "Good day, Miss Coyne." And he was already writing. Emmett found his voice then. It came out low, and it came out ugly. "What did you do?" I looked at my brother. I did not gloat. I want you to know that. I'd waited a long time, and I did not gloat, because our father was in me even then, and he never crowed over a downed man in his life. I just said, "Papa signed the fort over to me 9 years ago, Emmett. I've ridden this road every season since. You took the grass and the cattle and my name off the book. You never once asked who the army paid, and I put the money in my coat, and I walked to the bay, and I rode home ahead of him, alone, the same as I'd come." Now you might think that was the end of it. It wasn't. That was the middle. Because a man like Emmett doesn't fall in one blow. He thrashes, and he tries every door, and every door has to be shut in its turn before it's truly finished. He tried the county first, rode into Cordell that same week, and stood in the clerk's office and demanded to know how his own contract could pay his own sister off his own ranch. And the clerk pulled the filing, because it was public record, and there it was in my father's hand and Mercer's countersign, the beef contract, Della Coyne, holder of record, renewed every spring for 9 years running. Legal as sunrise. The clerk shrugged. There was nothing there for Emmett to break. He'd have had better luck arguing with the weather. He tried the buyers, thinking maybe he'd sell the beef private and skip the army altogether. But the fort took 45 head a month at a good fixed price, and no private buyer in that dry country matched it. And every man Emmett went to had stood on that parade ground or heard the story from a man who had. They weren't going to hitch their business to a man who'd just been read out in front of the whole garrison. He came home from Cordell each time, a little grayer. And the note came due. That's the piece he'd forgotten to be afraid of. $6,800 to Pardee's Stockman's Bank, 90 days, secured against the ranch, and he'd signed it dead certain the beef money would clear it. But the beef money came to me. It came to my hand on that parade ground, and it went into my coat, and there was not a legal thread on earth to pull it back to him. So when Pardee's note fell due, Emmett had 400 head of cattle and a good brand, and 1,100 acres of grass, and not the cash to pay a $6,800 debt. Cattle aren't money. That was the whole thing he never understood, right down to the last. Cattle are cattle. The money runs through the paper, and the paper had my name on it. Pardee, cold and lawful as those bankmen are, sent notice of foreclosure. 11 days late, and the machinery started to turn. And Emmett Coyne, Baron of the Lazy Sea, sole coin that mattered, owner of the grass and the cattle and the brand, stood to lose every acre to a Cordell banker over a debt his own sister's contract could have cleared 3 times over. He came to me at last. Of course he did. There was nowhere else to go. It was evening, and I was in the bunk room, at the plank table, with my mother's double wedding ring quilt on the cot behind me, the quilt I'd carried out there myself the morning after we buried Papa, folded square. Emmett filled the doorway. He'd been a big man his whole life, and he filled a door. But something had gone out of him. He started hard. He said, "You'll sign that money over to the note. It's this family's ranch, and you'll not let a bank take it out of spite." I didn't answer that. I let it sit in the room and go stale. Then he changed. That's the thing about a man who's only ever had one tool. When it breaks, he's got nothing, and he'll go from threat to begging in the space of a breath. And it's a terrible thing to watch in your own brother. He said, "Della, we're blood. Papa'd want the place kept whole, You can't want to see it sold off." His voice cracked on it. He'd have taken it back if he could. The supper, the brand book, the roan, all of it. Not because he was sorry, I don't think, but because it hadn't worked. But I let the silence do the work. I'd learned the worth of it. I didn't shout, and I didn't gloat. I let him hear his own words fall into a quiet room and find out how little they carried, now that the money wasn't his. I said, "Go on back to the house, Emmett. I'll come see you when I've decided what's to be done." And he went. That was the strangest sight of all, my brother, who'd told 100 men where to stand, turning and going because his little sister told him to. That night I did a thing I'd put off for weeks. I opened the tin box again, the old tea tin from behind our father's Bible, and I took out the contract, and under it, folded small, was a paper I'd seen the first time and had not let myself read close. My father's hand. I knew it the way you know a voice. He'd written it years back, the year my mother passed, when he first put the fort over to my name. And it wasn't a will, and it wasn't a legal thing. It was just Papa, talking to me on paper the way he never quite could to my face. He wrote that he'd watched his 2 children grow. He wrote that Emmett had the size and the noise and the wanting, and that folks would follow noise, and that Emmett would come back someday and take the loud things, the grass and the gate and the name over the door, because those were the things a man like Emmett could see. And he wrote, I have it near to word for word, I've read it so many times. He wrote, "So I've put the thread that pulls the money where the quiet worker holds it. Della does the work. Della rides the road. Let Della hold the thread. Grass and cattle a fool can lose in a season. But the one who keeps the books keeps the place, in the end, whether the world sees it or not." He knew. That's the thing I sat with in the lamplight that night, and cried a little, finally, which I hadn't done at his grave. He'd seen Emmett whole, years before Emmett ever rode home. He hadn't left me the contract because I was near, or because it was easy. He'd left it to me on purpose, a quiet blade set aside for the day it'd be needed, because he trusted the one who did the work and not the one who wanted the crown. I folded the letter back under the contract. I felt less alone than I had since we put him in the ground. The next morning I saddled the bay and I rode into Cordell, to the stockman's bank, with the beef money in my coat. Josiah Pardee was a lean, dry, careful man, and he stood up when I came in, which he had not done at the cattleman's supper. Word travels. He knew by then whose hand the army money had gone into. I sat down across his desk and I set the money on the wood between us, counted and banded, and I said, "You hold a note against the Lazy C60 800, signed by my brother Emmett, past due." "I do," he said. "I'd like to buy it," I said. He looked at me a long moment. A banker understands this kind of thing faster than a rancher ever will. He understood exactly what it meant, that I meant to hold not just the money but the debt, that I'd own the very paper that could take the ranch out from under my brother. He said, "Careful, you understand what you'd be holding, Miss Coyne." "I understand it better than anyone alive," I said. "Draw it up." And he drew it up. He counted the money, and it was good, and he stamped that $6,800 note paid across its face, and he assigned it over to me, Della Coyne, and it became mine. The whole debt of the Lazy C in my coat, alongside the season's beef money that had cleared it. And through the front window of the bank, out on the boardwalk of Cordell, my brother Emmett stood watching a transaction he could not walk in and stop. He'd followed me to town. He stood there in the cold light and watched his sister buy the chain that held his ranch, and there was not a single thing he could do but watch. I held both, now, the money that came in and the debt that went out. He owned the grass and the cattle and the brand. I owned the paper the whole thing ran on, coming and going. The Lazy C was worthless in his hands, and worth everything in mine, and every soul in that county understood it by nightfall. He came to the bunk room the next evening. And this is the part I'd want you to remember, if you remember any of it. because it would have been the easiest thing in the world to throw him off the place. I held the note. I could have called it and let Pardee's machinery finish and stood on the porch of the main house and watched him ride out with nothing, the way he'd meant me to go. It would have been fair. God knows it would have been fair. He stood in the doorway. He didn't threaten this time. He didn't beg either. He'd used those up. He just said, "Lo, I've come to ask what the terms are." And there it was. My brother, who'd lifted our father's chair to the head of the table and told 11 neighbors and a preacher that a working ranch was no place for a spinster's bookkeeping, my brother had come to the bunk room to ask his spinster sister for terms. I didn't stand up. I reached over to the shelf and I took down the tin box and I opened it and I took out the contract and I unfolded it on the plank table between us. The third time that folded paper had done its work, planted in a Bible, carried to a fort, and now laid flat on a bunkroom table in front of the man it had beaten. I smoothed it out with my hand. He looked down at it. He knew now what it was. He'd learned the hard way what a signature was worth. I said, "You can stay and work the lazy sea, under my signature. The beef goes to the fort in my name, the way it always did, the way Papa said it. You'll draw a hand's wage and a home, and you'll answer to the books, the little things, Emmett, the little things that turned out to be the whole thing. Or you can ride out the way you came in, with Cattletown certainty and nothing under it. That's the terms. That's all of them." I didn't raise my voice. I never once raised my voice through the whole of it, and I'm proud of that more than I'm proud of the money. I warned him of nothing, and I hid nothing, and I stole nothing. I just held what had always been mine, quiet, until the day it was worth showing. And behind him, out in the yard, I could see Vinya standing by the main house. The main house, whose curtains were mine to draw now, whose table was mine to sit at, and she wasn't laughing. She'd learned there was worth in a thing she'd sneered at, and it was a hard, dry lesson, and it cost her every inch of standing she'd bought in Cordell. The town that had watched her take the big house watched the ledger take it back. She never spoke to me cruel again. She never spoke to me much at all. Emmett stood there over the contract a long time. Then he said, so quiet I barely caught it, "I'll stay." And he did. Let me tell you how it looks now, because it's been 6 months, and I'm telling you this from the porch of the main house, in the first light, with a cup of coffee steaming in my hand and the whole valley going gold. The lazy sea herd is moving out to the good grass this morning, 1,100 head and more, and the brand book set right, my name back in it, written plain, not scratched over anything. The season's contract is renewed and filed at Fort Haskell in Della Coyne's hand, the way it's been 9 years running and the way it'll stay. The tin box sits on the mantel now, out where a body can see it, my father's letter folded back inside his Bible where it belongs. I don't hide it anymore. There's nothing left to hide. Silas Boone is foreman, 19 years old and steady as an old post, and he earned it standing quiet beside me through the whole long silence when speaking would have cost us everything. He runs the crew, and the crew respects him, and he still comes and finds me of an evening, only now he doesn't ask if I'm all right. He tells me how the grass is holding. Emmett works a good day. I'll give him that. He's a hand now, and he's a fair hand, and he rides out with the others, and he comes in at dark, and he doesn't ask me one thing about the mail. He learned. Some men can't. But he did, in his way. And Vinya learned to keep a clean ledger, which is a good deal more than she ever wanted to learn. She helps me with the accounts through the winter. Her sums are honest. I'll say that for her. He came to me once, Emmett, on a Sunday, and stood at the porch rail, and said he was sorry. Not a long speech, he never had the words. Just I was wrong about you, Della, and I'm sorry for it, and I could have thrown it back at him. I could have named every offense, the quilt and the chair and the brand book and the roan mare he sold, but I poured him a cup of coffee and set it on the rail beside his hand, and I let it stand there between us. I didn't take him in my arms, and I didn't turn my back. I just let it be what it was, a true thing, said Late, worth a cup of coffee, and no more and no less. He drank it. We watched the herd. That was enough. Because here's the whole of what I learned, and I'll give it to you plain, and then I'll let you go. They take the loud things first. The house, the chair at the head of the table, the name over the gate. Let them. Those are the things a body can see, and folks will always chase what they can see. But the work outlasts the name on the gate. The paper outlasts the noise. The one who does the quiet thing, day after day, road after road, book after book, with nobody thanking her, she holds the thread the whole thing hangs from, and one day the world finds out, all at once, in front of everybody, exactly what that thread was worth. My father knew it. He set it aside for me years before I needed it, because he trusted the worker over the crown. And I kept it whole, and I held my silence, and I never once had to raise my voice. The coffee's gone cold in my hand and the sun's full up over the lazy sea now, and every head of cattle on that grass is bought and paid and mine to answer for. That's a good weight to carry. It's the weight my father carried, and his daughter carries it now, and the name on the gate can say whatever it likes. If you've ever done the quiet work while somebody louder took the credit, if you've ever been the one who kept the books nobody thanked you for, then you know already what Della knew. So tell me, comment the town you're watching from, and tell me one thing you held on to quiet, and waited on, and were proved right about in the end. I'd dearly love to know how far Della's ride carries.